Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Abel Salinas wash processed Ecuador from Flower Child Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Flower Child, based out of Oakland, California. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel multiple times before. But the main reason for this review is that it gives us an opportunity to compare and contrast this Abel Salinas with the ones we previously reviewed from Say and Counterculture. In addition to that, I've been looking for a reason to review more Flower Child's coffees, and we'll have plenty of opportunities to do so here in the near future, as they're currently offering quite a few Ecuadorian coffees. But for now, we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the higher extraction recipe we use for some of Say's coffees, which is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. We just went a little bit more fine on this one as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, Flower Child is definitely one of the lighter roasting coffee roasters in the United States as well. As a lot of people would say that they're somewhat or very close to being on par with Say in terms of lightness. So this one is a pretty light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and it did offer some shades of other Abel Salinas coffees that we'd previously reviewed, though perhaps not as straightforward and sweet as those, as this first impression offered a little bit more of a floral aspect to it. There's a fair bit of these citric components with a slightly delightful stone fruit on the cool down. Other than that, I would say it was a pretty nice start, if maybe not necessarily quite as sweet and quite to the same extent as some of the other first impressions we had had from this coffee. Day 17 through the Chemex, and similar results, as it's sweet but not to the same extent as those other versions, but perhaps a slight bit more emphasis on the brightness, as that's the first takeaway I had from this one, as the other versions of the Abel Salinas coffees weren't necessarily the most bright coffees out there, though this one right at the start did seem to offer just a slight bit more of that. In addition to that, there's a subtle florality and a slight citric aspect present yet again, so consistent in those two regards early on. We continue on to day 20 as we opted for the April brewer, and there's more similarities as it continues to remain the least sweet of the Abel Salinas coffees we had, but with much greater emphasis on the brightness and the florality. In addition to that, there's a honey forward aspect to the cup upon the cool down, including a slightly bitter vanilla. Another pretty good day, if maybe not necessarily to the extent we were hoping. Day 24, higher temperatures, a more fine grind, and while the coffee does feel a little bit improved, it feels like it might have peaked in terms of the sweetness, as I think at this point I was kind of getting the impression that this is about as sweet as this version of this coffee was actually going to get, which in one regard, it's still a very sweet coffee relative to, I would say, the vast majority of coffees. But even then, given that the previous experiences with this one were on the more sweet side, I think I was just expecting and hoping for a little bit more out of it in that specific category. There continues to remain more of that focus on the brightness and floral side of things, a bit more definition in terms of the tropical side, as it's a bit more reminiscent of a sweeter citric aspect. The peachiness is present in the most abundance it has been up to this point, so definitely a vastly improved day from this try. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there's a case to be made for this coffee actually being the most balanced of the Abel Salinas ones we've reviewed up to this point, as the sweetness may not necessarily be as strong and focused, but it's a better rounded coffee in terms of the brightness, the florality. Those things just gave it a little bit more depth as opposed to what some people might consider the other Abel Salinases to be just one-dimensional, maybe a little bit too straightforward in terms of the sweetness. This one right here just offering a little bit more in terms of that, as well as a nice bit of texture and some citric attributes, gave this cup, just as mentioned, some of that additional depth. Previously mentioned peach is also present, as it's present in a somewhat more subtle sense. Day 30, back through the V60, and the primary focus continues to remain on the florality and the brightness, as the sweetness is notable, but still a little bit more subtle relative to some of the other experiences in this one. Pretty nice definition to the brightness, as the listed pair is in line with the slight sugary aspects of that fruit. Depth with some soft peach, as well as the citric attributes present yet again. Day 33 through the Chemex, and the cup does feel like it's improving, as it has the best definition up to this point. A very clean cup, and I do have to say that if anything, maybe it's the one that had the best definition, a little bit more clarity in that regard, as the listed apple and pear continue to be very well defined with a complementary florality. And the one case I can make for the Chemex, because they were actually pretty close in terms of my preference, is that it really did seem to accentuate a lot of the more defined qualities, the cleaner qualities in this one, as it's a pretty clean cup of coffee to begin with. These just seemed to offer a little bit more in that specific sense. Sweetness definitely still present, though, as mentioned, it seemed like it's actually kind of peaked in terms of how sweet I was able to get to this one. Day 37, one last day through the V60, and there's been consistency as the pear apple brightness is present yet again, cooling down more into a sweeter and peach-like cup. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So as I'd kind of mentioned, I would say that this one is actually the one that felt like it might have had the most definition, as specifically in terms of the brightness, the acidity that was present within this one. It felt very well defined, and that was one of the biggest parts of this coffee that I could say was setting it apart from the other ones we'd previously discussed. So that's one thing I really wanted to highlight and emphasize about this specifically, is the cleanliness and clarity of this coffee. Finish, level 4. So yes, it did finish in a much more even sense. I mentioned at times that there was a honeyed attribute to this one, as that's a little bit typical for these Mejorado coffees. That's usually how Pepe describes the Mejorado sweetness that's present within them. And I can see that with a lot of coffees. It's a little bit more pronounced in this one, as it has that floral aspect to it. In that honey sense, though, a little bit more of a floral honey as opposed to like a super honeysuckle-like attribute to it. And then in addition to that, there's like a vanilla attribute as well that also goes in line with that florality. But those are kind of the finishing attributes of this one. So finish at level 4, definitely justified. Sweetness level 4. So as much talk of the sweetness that we've had in this video, I did want to say that it's still a very sweet coffee, and even then I would say it's a little bit more of a true level 4, maybe on the slightly higher side of the level 4, though fully expecting this one to maybe be as sweet as those other ones was probably the only big drawback I had from it, because I was kind of trying to force edge, trying to push that, and at that time, I think it was at day 24 mark, I just kind of came to the realization that I just don't think it's going to get there, which is more than fine because it offered enough in other categories to make up for it. Acidity, level 4. That one is the one I'm specifically referencing because, as mentioned, this one felt like it had the most brightness, the most acidity of the 3 Abel Salinas coffees that we have had. So that is the only one that justified that. I feel like if I was drinking these coffees or making these coffees side by side, the one what's going to help this one really stick out from those other two is a little bit less sweetness and just a little bit more brightness. And I think it would be pretty easy to detect because I think both of those things were very memorable from the other 2 versions of this coffee. Florality, level 4, we discussed that a little bit in depth already, but as mentioned, a little bit more of that honey florality, a little bit more of that vanilla florality, and that was one of the more pronounced components within this one as well, right alongside of the citric attribute, which I mentioned quite a bit, and some of the things that go into that category, I've said before, apple and pear, that's kind of the best place I can put them, as they're not really berries or stone fruits either. So usually I like to lump them into a citric category, but in addition to that, there is we'll say lemon attributes to this one, as well as there is a fair bit of citric qualities as well to this cup. And then we have a couple of level 3s. We will start with the berry fruit level 3. So I would say that I don't necessarily have an overly defined berry attribute in this one. It's a little bit more of like a melon-like attribute within this coffee, and that's also alongside of the stone fruits, which is there at that level 3, though that one was a little bit better defined of a peachy attribute that was also present within this one. So those 2 things, definitely something that I was experiencing, I would say, in enough moderation to justify those level 3 marks. Caramel, level 3. That, of course, is that Mejorado-like sweetness, as it's not something I've mentioned too much. I did say that it's slightly present in terms of a honeyed sense, but in addition to that, it does offer that ever so slight brown sugar-like component to it, that ever so slight brown candied component to it. It's a little bit more subtle. It's maybe not as pronounced or in your face as a lot of other Mejorado coffees, but even then, it's still present. And then the final level 3 is the body, as I mentioned that this one has a little bit more texture. I can't recall exactly where the other Abel Salinas coffees charted in terms of the body, but this one right here, I did make note of it having just a little bit more body than I might have expected, given the Mejorado coffees don't necessarily always have the most amount of body. But yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, So my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I've actually heard quite a few people's opinions on this one, and people have been really big fans of this coffee, and I can see a lot of the reasons why. This one felt like it was very well balanced, and I think that's a lot of the feedback I've received from other people as well, is that it just feels like a little bit more pretty of a version of this coffee, and I can definitely see that. I think going into this, a lot of people might expect that I was a little let down, that it didn't have the same level of sweetness as some of the other versions, but I think I appreciated this one for being a little different from those other ones just for that reason alone. I saw so many similarities between the Say and Counterculture version in terms of specific flavor profiles, in terms of specific sweeter categories, but this one right here offering something a little different while still not necessarily sacrificing some of the nicer qualities, just giving it a little bit more depth and making it a little bit more well-rounded of a coffee, makes me kind of appreciate this one a little bit more for what it was. If I'm honestly trying to figure out which of the three was my favorite, it's probably still the Say version. This one probably was my least favorite, but I would say that they were all really close, if I'm being honest. They all still offered a lot of the things that I'm looking for: great clarity, great sweetness, great florality, as well as enough of a fruit profile to make up for all of those other things. So really nice coffees for me, and this one was no exception to that either. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you have enjoyed the Mejorado coffees in the past and you're just looking for a little bit more brightness, so still keep in mind the sweeter attributes of them, then this one's a pretty good fit, as not only did it offer that, but it offered some really nice clarity and definition to couple with that as well. Still offering plenty of the Mejorado-like components, in addition to add a fair bit of body and texture to the cup, giving it just some nice well-rounded depth, and I think that's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Abel Salinas wash processed Ecuador from Flower Child Coffee. Thank you for watching.